All right, welcome to the call tonight, everyone. We've got a lot of things to discuss with the recent audit that we had in our office. And I want to discuss with you guys just the slides today about handling earnest money for residential purchase and sale of contracts. We were audited for the commercial transactions, but the areas of opportunity or the issues that we have to resolve with the DOL actually has to do with the residential. So if you are doing commercial and you're doing well with your earnest money, you know, kudos to you, but we are going to focus today only on residential purchase and sale contracts. All right, next slide. So what we're going to cover is what is earnest money, why it's important. We'll cover that very quickly. We're going to discuss the difference between the promissory note versus the check versus wire. There have been some changes, and I would love to get Chris's take on wiring cutoffs and timelines and things of that nature. We will talk about the responsibility that you have in regards to earnest money. What are the timelines? What constitutes earnest money being late? Jerry Kay is she saved my hiney sheets on the DOL audit. I can't tell you how many files we went through that she actually was able to prove that we were actually on time rather than late. So we're going to go over some best practices for that. When to use the addendum to change the earnest money and how it's being deposited. And there are few exceptions, but there are a few that we can discuss. So full plate tonight. I think you guys will take a lot out of the recent audit. Feel the burn is what I'm going to say tonight. It was painful. It was painful. I got the hardest auditor, Chris. Jerry Kay knows. He came to Tacoma first, thinking that this was our main office, and then he ended up going to Tukwila, and it was like all hands on deck. It was brutal. He's the toughest of the 9 auditors that are out there. So we're going to share a little bit with you guys tonight on that. Next slide. So what is earnest money and why is it important? As the auditor wanted me to point out to all of you, it is the most important thing that he catches, and the issues and complaints that they have in the state of Washington is because of earnest money. And things have changed since they used to do collect earnest monies back in the 90s. This particular auditor that we had actually used to be a real estate broker in the 1990s, and he made sure to point that out to me on every chance he got and give me pointed examples of why we need to be much more clear with everyone here on the call and in Best Choice Realty about earnest money and why it's important. But number one thing is who holds the earnest money. Next slide. I'm seeing still, and Jerry Kay has seen this as well, it's surprising, but earnest money is $2,000 here. This is something from one of the contracts we reviewed, and nothing was checked. They just put the earnest money on there, and they didn't check any of the boxes. And so that's very unclear, and that's not effective. That is something that would be called on an audit. So you do have to check the box. You either have to check the check, the note. If it's a wire or a cashier's check, you need to check the other box and write cashier's check or wire. If it's held by the closing agent, that's what you need to do at Best Choice Realty. We do not hold the earnest money check. So I don't want to have a buyer's agent hold the earnest money where this box is checked. However, there's one, maybe 2 firms that I know of that we've done business with that it's okay to hold, for them to hold the earnest money in their firm. So we're going to talk about what to ask for. If you're a listing agent and a buyer's agent comes and they check the box where their firm is holding the earnest money, we'll talk about what you need for that. Next slide. Here's the reasons for the earnest money. And you would be surprised, but people are still not checking this box as well. So hopefully you're not one of those offenders on the call. But we do not use this one. This would be only if you want the opportunity to sue above and beyond the earnest money. So we don't want litigation. So most of the files, 99% of the files that I review or that Jerry Kay reviews is going to check this box right here, forfeiture of earnest money. It then allows for earnest money to be disputed. Let's say the deal does not come together and we have to sue or take legal action against the other party. we don't have the election of remedies. We're only dealing with the earnest money. So that's the reason why we're talking about earnest money, is because it is part of the contract. It's what keeps the glue together. We had an experience 2 days ago where, which was last week, last Thursday, we had a class that I attended, and it was a class with an attorney, and the attorney was talking with another agent who was new to the business. And then one of our new agents, Esther's husband, who just recently got licensed, spoke up. And I was so glad he spoke up, because he talked about earnest money being skin in the game. This is what keeps the parties working toward the common goal of getting to a finish line. And this particular broker that was saying, oh, I only write promissory notes when I write offers, he was very upfront with this particular other agent from another company in telling her that that was not the way, in practice, that wasn't really going to benefit her or the seller or the parties in the transaction if she's always using promissory notes. And I thought that was an interesting debate that we had a couple nights ago on that. Next slide. So here's the elephant in the room. We were cited at Best Choice Realty for earnest monies that were deemed late. So when we dug deeper, and I had Jerry Kay and Shannon go in deeper to find out, would we be up for more fines if we were to have this continue the way we are continuing? The fines would go through the roof, and I don't want to have those types of fines. So I had to do a write-up, but there is a $5,000 fine per occurrence for earnest money deposit receipt that's being late. And I have to basically look at the files. I have to do a write-up and come up with how I'm not going to have this happen in our firm again. So that's the fine. You guys, you think I'm going to pay the $5,000 fine? I don't think so. If you're currently working with Best Choice Realty and we were assessed a fine, I'm not paying the fine. You would be paid a fine if I got fined or cited by the DOL. However, I'm going to try to avoid that at all costs. So I provided the DOL with 2 probable solutions, and I think they're going to be okay with that, and we'll have a clean record. But I want to share with you what I came up with. Go ahead, next slide. So I did a proposed update to our policies and procedures handbook. So I don't know if the DOL would be fine with this. I think they will because of this. The sales agent is required to provide the company with an earnest money deposit receipt acquired from title and escrow, or their trust account if we're representing the seller, where they're holding, a Coldwell Banker is holding the earnest money. Then we have to make sure that earnest money, if it's late after 3 business days, we will need to get an addendum that says, and that alerts both the parties that the earnest money shall be deposited on or before, and then insert a date. We actually had a commercial broker. I'm just going to give kudos to James Gardner. He's one of our Best Choice agents. He was new to the firm when he got his real estate license, but he knows about this, how important this is to me. And he went ahead on one of his commercial transactions that was audited by the DOL. He placed this in an addendum, and the auditor was like, wow, this is what all of your brokers need to do if their earnest money is late. Doesn't matter if you represent the seller or if you represent the buyer and you know the earnest money is late, they should create an addendum. If failure to do so will incur a non-refundable $500 fine assessed against the sales agent. So if, let's say, you close escrow and there's nothing that describes why the file is late, the firm would have the right to charge a $500 late fee if the earnest money is not taken care of. Now, again, this would be if you fail to, and we need to get you paid out. We're not going to hold up, not get you paid out, but we could assess a fine if you're wanting to not follow the rules here and getting this done. Next slide. The other thing, I'm going to turn it over to Jerry Kay, is what the other solution that we came up with the DOL to get us to pass through the audit process. And I think the DOL likes this idea as well. This was actually Jerry Kay's deal. She's like, I'm already reviewing the file. Would it be all right if we put this into a reminder system? And although the DOL may want us to incur, have us fine you guys, I would love to be able to not have that happen, where you comply with the transaction review reminder. So Jerry Kay, explain to the group here what you do when you review the file. I gotta probably unmute her. Hang on. There, unmute you. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, one of the things, the important things that we probably need to remind you first, in order for me to review the file, you have to turn in your documents on time. So it's really hard when I'm not getting documents until day of closing or a couple days before closing. Then I can't help you find things that could cause you to get a $5,000 fine. So you need to turn your files in early, within 48 hours. And that's part of this transaction review reminder. It does say that in there, that you are to deliver your documents within 48 hours of getting them all signed around. That's in your agent agreement. So we want you to be following the guidelines. And so after I get the earnest money deposit receipt, we're going to check to see when was mutual, when did it occur? Because sometimes that's not always clear. And so that's the first thing we need to do, is determine mutual. And then from there, we start counting the days for
Earnest receipt, right?
earnest money receipt. And I'm looking for 2 days. So that's my first look. And if I notice the review you're going to get, you'll see the verbiage down here below of what you need to know. The little verbiage in there says earnest money is required and deposited within 2 business days from mutual acceptance. Or we do need to update this a little bit. You can get a receipt from the agent if it is after 2 days. It's a Form 89, and we're going to talk about that a little later. But that's the other thing. But this is just a reminder email that goes out to the agents well in advance before you guys close.
Okay, next slide. So if it's late, Jerry Kay will be sending you out this, and this is how you deal with it. So if it's late, and if you're working with a transaction coordinator, the transaction coordinators have already been briefed on this. So they'll be helping to help you get this earnest money if you're using a transaction coordinator. But if you're managing your own, I'm going to tell you guys, I have been guilty of this myself, where for whatever reason, it gets busy and all of a sudden 2 business days goes by really fast. So, you know, we get mutual, say on Friday before 9 p.m., mutual acceptance, that only gives me until Tuesday to make sure that I get my check picked up from my client. And I may not have opened up escrow because I just was so busy showing homes and negotiating another deal. So those 2 business days can come and go, and it's okay. But we do need to get an addendum created to make sure, or just, you know, let the parties know that my earnest money is late. Okay, so that's the part where we're going to need your help to do this. Next slide. So go to the next slide. There's a promissory. Some of you have been taught improperly from your last company. So I'm just going to step right into this. Promissory notes is your promise to pay. So like I said earlier in the call, you know, with that one agent who was, she's like, I write promissory notes with all of my offers. Well, this is not advised. A promissory note, what she said, and again, it came across really wrong in the meeting, but what she's doing is she's including a Form 31 with all of her offers, and she's checking this box. And I would say, do not do that if you're working for Best Choice. However, if you know that it's going to take you longer to do the inspection, maybe you don't want to deposit your earnest money until after inspection, then you would want to use a Form 31, and you're amending the contract with a Form 31. However, don't forget, it's a note. It's a promissory note with a promise to pay. So I don't advise using a promissory note unless you have an extenuating circumstance. Is get in the game, and it's not proper for the seller. If I got a promissory note and we're in a mutual or a multiple offer situation, I'm going to wait the offers. And if somebody has an earnest money promissory note, I'm not going to like that as much or advise my seller to go with a promissory note over somebody who's willing to put money and work with WFG escrow or whatever title company to make sure that the earnest money clears the account. So try not to use the Form 31. Make it like, you know, maybe a second or third choice, but this is a Form 31 that you could use in an instance where you maybe want to have your earnest money where it's like after the inspection. Upon removal of the inspection contingency would be what you would write in this section. I am going to use it with one of our brokers who ended up spending their earnest money, And so in order to keep the deal together, we got the parties, both the buyer and the seller, to agree to a promissory note, and everybody's cool with it. But again, it requires the buyers to send this, and we have to adjust it on a Form 34 as well because of that change to the contract. Next slide. Here's an example of a wire with WFG. Is this a check or is this a wire? So this is where I'm going to put Chris on the line here. Chris, what would this be an example of? Are you there, Chris? Oh, I've got to unmute. There you go.
Then I muted myself.
Okay, there you go.
Well, that's actually a copy of a check. It's a personal check.
And so you can see that WFG did a good job of whiting out the account numbers, right?
We did, and I mean, I don't want to go too deeply in the weeds on that, but that's definitely a personal check. And there are a few things that come along with using a personal check. I don't need to necessarily go into those things, but there are just some stipulations as far as how quickly money either can be released or released back to a buyer, say if the contract gets terminated, things like that. So,
so if you were to compare, yeah, you don't have to compare, but if you could compare, WFG obviously looks at, got some background noise here. It might be Vegas.
That's John Coltrane. Let me turn that down.
There you go.
Sorry. Gosh. Okay.
My cochlear implant's going beep, beep, beep. So explain to the group the difference between, like if you're in a negotiation standpoint, Chris, and you're WFG, I put WFG title as my escrow company. Is there a difference between a check and then like a wire? What can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's, we want to have, quote unquote, it's got to be good funds. And so the reality of it is a personal check gets written and dropped off. That is a pretty common way to receive earnest money. The only problem with that could potentially be is that it's usually a seasoning period before that money can either be released. Say, for instance, if you as a seller are requiring the earnest monies in a period of time after going mutual, or a buyer needs to get refunded, we have to have proof that that money has actually cleared the account if it's done through a personal check. So that's one piece of it with a check. A wire is always going to be the best option. The problem with a wire sometimes is you have to deal with your institutional cutoffs as well as the federal government cutoff. So if you're in a time crunch, sometimes if you're in a geographical crunch, it can sometimes be the best thing to do as long as you do it early enough in the day. Otherwise, a personal check, things like that can get receipted the same day of, and that simplifies the process a little bit more.
Okay, that kind of explains. Next slide. So there are responsibilities that you have. This is, again, every agent that's on the call. I don't want you guys, I think a lot of you think, oh, it's just escrow's responsibility. It is not. The DOL auditor actually personally called a few of the brokers at Best Choice Realty just to get a sense of how we treated earnest money. And I was not impressed with a few of the answers that we received. Where they, oh, I didn't know. I mean, again, people get sloppy as they start progressing. And so I want to make sure that all of you have the same chat, and I have recorded this. Responsibility for earnest money is in the purchase and sale agreement. Next slide. It is in the section B. So it's on page 2. It says buyers shall deliver the earnest money within 2 days after mutual acceptance to the selling broker or to the closing agent. If the buyer delivers the earnest money to the selling broker will deposit any check to be held by the selling firm or deliver any earnest money to be held by the closing agent within 3 days of receipt of mutual acceptance, whichever occurs later. So I'm going to turn it over to Jerry Kay to explain how we look at this, because that's confusing for people. So Jerry Kay, go ahead and speak up on this.
I think a lot of us get the number. I mean, I know I have for years in my head. I always thought it was 3. I have 3 days. I have 3 days, but that's really not the case. So your buyer has 2 days. Your buyer has 2 days to either get it to escrow or hand it over to their agent. Mm-hmm. Now, and then the agent gets an extra day. If you turn it into me as an agent, then we get an extra up to 3 days with a receipt that you write down. You have 3 days to get it back into escrow. The problem that I've been finding is, for example, Chris, on the wire, If you initiate a wire, you tell your buyer to go, oh, I want to do a wire. And on day 2, they go and initiate the wire. It's going to be late because it's not going to land there until the 3rd day. So at that point, you're going to need to prepare Form 34 and change the terms of when the earnest money is due. One of the other things that we're going to need, and it's your guys' responsibility, whether you're on the listing side, is to get a Form 89 and we have examples of this coming up. So if you get a little confused, other firms like Windermere, they don't call it an 89. They call it a WRE Form 20, or Berkshire Hathaway calls it an earnest money receipt. If you get that receipt from the other selling broker, then that gives us up to 3 more days to get that earnest money into escrow's hands and get the escrow deposit receipt. So we're essentially maybe looking for 2 receipts in the file.
Yeah, and that could be because of the way the earnest money is being collected. So I guess the important thing is, if I'm sitting here thinking, okay, how soon do I need to collect the earnest money? Right away.
Right away.
If I have a check that's, that I've collected, I could take a picture of it, right? And that would be a receipt, and email it to myself and email it to the client. That's a good way to do it. I used to have to do a receipt book, but that would be sufficient to say I've collected the check. And then the check then can be picked up by any title or escrow company except for First American, all of the rest of them will come and do a courtesy pickup. So First American, we've had problems with First American with the FedEx, because by the time they send the FedEx label and then your client goes and delivers it to a FedEx station and then they actually receive it, those are all late as well. So it's extremely frustrating for all of the parties. And then now the buyer changes their mind on day 5 and says, I want to back out of the deal. Where's the earnest money? And then who's responsible? I can tell you right now, the DOL is not going to be calling Chris at WFG because the earnest money was late or it was never delivered. They're going to be calling me, and they're going to be calling you, the agent on the file, to figure out what happened. Why did it not get delivered? And we've been able to save some people in our firm from those headaches because of the communication and what we can do to help you mitigate some of these types of instances. But it's serious business when you're talking about $40,000 earnest money check, a $50,000 earnest money check. For some people, even a $5,000 earnest money check is frustrating if they lose that, or if they have to be sued because of that. Next slide.
Yes, some of the escrow companies they won't write you a receipt unless the file's been opened, that they have a mutual signed around purchase and sale agreement. And sometimes that's going to move the date up. They won't receipt it until the next day when they get it. And so we'll be helping you watch those timelines to see if you have to go prepare Form 34 to change the dates.
So the one thing the auditor liked, and this is where computation comes into play, is the auditor asked me I was like, oh geez, I'm on the hot seat here, Gary K. Like, this is the question they asked me. Do you, the designated broker, make the determination on when mutual acceptance is done? And I was like, oh geez. If I answer yes, is that a problem? And if I answer no, is that a problem? I'm like, didn't know what to answer. And so I kind of guessed, but this is what we do, and we do it internally. So I just said, what we do is Jerry Kay and I review the files that come through our firm, and we determine when mutual acceptance occurs. And I was like, relieved, whoo, oh gosh, because that is the correct answer. He wants the designated brokers, the DOL is asking the designated brokers or managing brokers to be responsible to determine when computation of time can start. So when mutual acceptance was reached. So Jerry Kay and I are ultimately the ones that go into our paperless pipeline system and determine when mutual happens. If you have a question about your mutual acceptance or you're not sure, that's a simple text message or a phone call or an email to one of us, and we can tell you when the computation of time begins. Sometimes it's not clear. Sometimes you have a Form 34 or you have a Form 36, or maybe there's a holiday. We recently tested some transaction coordinators' knowledge on how to deal with, I think it was, what was it, President's Day? Because that was a legal holiday. And I'm telling you right now, I'm not going to point blame on anybody because we did a little training exercise to help them. But even TCs get confused sometimes when it comes to the holidays on what is considered mutual and when do all the timelines begin. So you ultimately are responsible for making sure you understand what's a business day, what's a holiday, what's a weekend, but we will help you in determining what mutual acceptance, what date that starts from.
And you guys need to help us too, because sometimes you change something in the body of that in the file that isn't evident on page 1 per se, where most of the business happens. And it's okay to say, hey, Jerry K, we did some big change on the 22A on page 2. And I'm okay to like agree with you that, okay, that is mutual then. Yeah. So yeah, don't be afraid to let us know what's going on.
So I'm glad we have Chris on the call. When's the wiring cutoff times, Chris? I'm seeing more wires come across, maybe because of the type of earnest money and maybe people don't have checkbooks. I'm seeing more wiring being done in the last 2 years. When is the cutoff for that time?
3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time is the Fed cutoff, but one of the things you have to take into consideration is also your institutional cutoffs too as well. So sometimes we're dealing with some restrictions, and just because you get it in by that time, if the bank, your institution that you're working through isn't, accommodating those quickly, and they may have cutoffs that are separate or different than the Fed.
So let me run the scenario by you, Chris, because I'm like all about scenarios. That's how I learn. So let's say I got mutual acceptance on the 24th. That's pretty reasonable. Friday. We go out, we get mutual acceptance. We've been negotiating all week on back and forth. The mutual acceptance the 24th. If I put on there that it's going to be a wire, when would I have to have my client initiate the wire in this particular instance?
I would say by the morning of the 28th.
Yeah. See, I think a lot of you guys are waiting too long. And so then the client, so the 28th, they send it to their transaction coordinator or they set up escrow. So mutual acceptance on the 24th, per the purchase and sale agreement, we only have 2 days to deal with the earnest money, right? So one of the auditor caught one file and he's like, the seller ended up, we were representing the seller, the listing agent, some situation like this where there was a holiday involved. And what happened was that the client thought that they initiated, it was a $50,000 wire, but actually they initiated it, but it didn't hit escrow until it was late. It was considered late. So that was another one where we may have a fine incurred because of that one. I think we'll get through it okay because there's enough notes in the file that talk about the buyer and the seller and the agents knew about it being late. But again, an addendum would satisfy that issue. But Chris is correct. The sooner you get that initiated, because it does take some time because Memorial Day would be a banking holiday as well. 28th would be when you want to have your client initiate the wire. And I guess you said before 2 o'clock.
I would, in the Fed, people, most institutions will say, around that 2 o'clock mark is kind of the cutoff time that you're going to probably get from most when you go to do the wire. One other thing from an accommodation standpoint, we would want to make sure we try to make it as easy as we possibly can. And I think most other companies, title escrow companies, are probably going to do that as well. Is it doesn't matter geographically where your client or where the broker drops it off. So they could choose any office, or they could also reach out and we can just send a courier directly to a place of work. We can even send to a place of business, wherever that may or may not be. So there's some other options on this end of it in case it is going to be late, where if you can make the accommodations in another geographical area rather than where it's closing, and we can still make that happen and get that receipted for you guys. So
perfect. Next slide. So we're going to, looking at this calendar, before you go the next slide, as in that scenario where the 24th, Jerry K and I are going to do a review in the first week. So you may not get a notification that your earnest money is late until, maybe the 31st or the 1st of June. So that's what we're committed to doing for the Department of Licensing for our review, is that first week being a critical time. Next slide. So what constitute late earnest money? Well, wires, if they're sent on day 2. So Chris answered correctly. I didn't even cue you up for that, Chris. You got the answer correctly.
God, I was just going to pretend like I fainted when you asked me that. I was going to fall out of the picture.
Right. But if the buyer turns earnest money to escrow on day 3 or later, that's late. When escrow sends a FedEx or UPS label to the client for earnest money and it's delivered to escrow day 3 or later, that would be late. We've had a couple of those. Selling agents turn into escrow on day 3 or later without a selling agent receipt of earnest money, or a Form 34 extending earnest money deposit. This one was a sad one. One of the ones that we were audited on, where we represented the seller, and the auditor's like, it doesn't matter, you represent the seller. The buyer did a horrible job on the purchase and sale agreement. We got mutual, and there wasn't even addenda. There wasn't even all of the addenda lines filled in. It was one of the most sloppy contracts that I saw, and it was embarrassing to kind of go through that. But he said it doesn't really matter. The earnest money was late, and it was our responsibility to make sure that that selling agent did their job. If we're representing the seller, we still are required to get a copy of the receipt for the file. That is your responsibility, even if you're a listing agent. So don't think, oh, I'm the listing agent, so I don't have to worry about it, getting the earnest money turned in. No, you should worry just as much, if not more so, if you represent the seller in a situation like that. And if it is late, go ahead and prepare the addendum and have the buyer sign it so that you can stay in contract. If the seller says, no, I don't want to work with this buyer because they're not following through with their promises, then you as a listing agent should send over a notice and terminate the contract. And if you have a backup offer or you have another offer that's better, you can easily get out of the contract that way.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen that happen, Chris?
Yeah. And that's great advice.
Yep. I'm sure you have in your career seen that. This Form 89 that Jerry K referred to is a receipt. So you can download this and you can have these printed. I have a few in my car that are printed in my back seat. They're thrown in there somewhere. But you do need some sort of receipt. And you could actually, like I said, you could take a picture of the check and you could also send that to your client. That is also a receipt, especially if it's sent over and your buyer has acknowledged receiving that. That also is a receipt for earnest money. But this is a form number that you can easily print out and have available for your using in a situation where you're taking, that check from them or you're having them write that check out, and then you work with your escrow company to get it turned in. Okay. This is a sample of what Berkshire has. This would be sufficient also for a receipt. If we're looking for an earnest money receipt, and then another one from Windermere. This is their receipt. So it's not like we're reinventing the wheel here, you guys. There's Windermere's doing it, Berkshire's doing it. It is the hot topic at the DOL, and it does need to be properly documented. I think that's where we're running into some obstacles. Is there anything more to say on that, Jerry Kay?
No. The only thing that I have to say is about taking the picture of the receipt. It's fine to give that to your client, but if the other firm needs a copy, something in writing for their file too, because they're going to get the fine just as much as we're going to get the fine. Right. The picture of the check won't work. So you're going to need one of these receipts.
Yeah, and then maybe just do an addendum. And this addendum is the addendum that we used, that the DOL loved. I mean, once the auditor saw this, he was like, oh, good. It was late according to the purchase and sale agreement, but James had produced on a Form 34 where both parties had initialed that the earnest money will be deposited on or before February 22nd. Everybody was good with that. So we flew through that file very quickly. But when earnest money is late, that's just all you have to do is just do an addendum like that. Okay. There are exceptions. So we're going to go through these. This is the last slide that I have for tonight, and then I'll let you guys go. If there's some extenuating circumstances. I mean, one I just found last week that Jerry Kay and I looked at. She's like, this one's late, or they changed it to a promissory note, or something happened during the transaction. The deal closed. We need to pay the agent. But what I was able to do is determine with the agent that there was extenuating circumstances. There was emails. In fact, we went email to the email, maybe text messages between the real estate agents and the clients. So there was recognition. There was no signed addendum in the file. It would have been nice to have an assigned addendum, but we had emails between the parties talking about my clients going through cancer treatments and hey, their earnest money is running a little bit late. We appreciate having a good buyer for this property. So that kind of thing. Oh, sorry about the background noise. There, we got a few people that didn't mute their line. When a client doesn't have the money to pay for the earnest money, or they spent it before closing, you will need to go ahead and do a, I lost my screen. You will need to go ahead and do an adjustment or addendum before closing. So if your client does something kind of crazy, there are ways to salvage that or to make that right with the parties, but you do need to work with me and we'll help you with the addendum. The last exception would be when a buyer or seller won't sign the addendum for the extension of the earnest money deposit, then we would put a note in the file, but there is, that, again, the parties could still close, but again, that's a risky proposition. We will need to notate the file and provide some more documentation if we have a buyer or seller who won't sign the addendum for an extension on the earnest money deposit receipt. There will need to be some sort of communication between the parties. And we were able to fly through on some of those files that the auditor looked at. We were able to get through those audits because we had more documentation about the situation or the extenuating circumstances of why the earnest money was late. And hopefully you have some sort of reason between the parties and that they have been made aware that the buyer's earnest money was late, or that the seller, the seller was okay with that earnest money being late. If there's some extenuating circumstances or emails or notes, that often will get us, accepted through this process. And the other one that happens sometimes is when the earnest money turns into a non-refundable deposit. Escrow, there is a specific earnest money non-refundable clause that we would use. Again, an addendum would need to be done. So the escrow is instructed on how to make that a non-refundable deposit. Builders often have this type of language in their builder's contract, but those are kind of exceptions to the rule that are legally they are not bound to the whole 2-day, 3-day type of thing because their earnest money turns into a non-refundable deposit. So again, if you have those certain circumstances, be sure and reach out to Jerry Kay or myself, or even Chris. Chris has dealt with enough earnest money disputes. I had to get involved with some of those. He knows what's possible and what's not possible when it comes to, earnest money and disputes and things of that nature. So don't be all by yourself on an island when it comes to the exceptions. Let's make sure we handle those before closing if there is some issues with earnest monies being late or not being deposited. We don't want to have happen. I think Jerry Kay and I have one of them that, again, this might be somebody on the call. I apologize if it is. I'm not going to name out anybody today. But there was one instance, the agent did not, we represent the seller, and we counseled with this agent saying, hey, we need to get the earnest money. We need a copy of the earnest money check. The buyer's agent failed to give the earnest money check to escrow, and it's been over a week, and we still don't have a copy. And the agent's like, well, I want to keep the earnest money. Well, unfortunately, as a listing agent or a seller, you can't keep the earnest money. We can certainly terminate the contract, and that's what we advise this agent to do, but the agent has not even taken action. So then it becomes like, is this agent doing a good job for their seller and making sure that that earnest money is properly delivered? And if not, can we get an agreement on when it will be delivered so that we can keep the deal together? So watch out for those types of instances. Just because you're a listing agent doesn't mean that you shouldn't take this to heart. And I think that's all I had to say. Was there anything I missed, Jerry Kay? Chris? That's a lot of slides to cover in 30 minutes, so I appreciate your patience, you guys. If you have questions or you have issues with anything that you currently are working on, be sure to call me. I don't want to institute a fine if at all possible. I'd rather deal with the issue if the DOL will accept Jerry Kay's thorough review on the transactions once we get mutual acceptance and we get something in the file and we deal with this with an addendum. I would rather deal with that than to have to do fines after a close of escrow because our files have not been properly documented. I hate to go that route if we can avoid it. I think that's it. Thank you so much for jumping on, Chris. I appreciate your insight, and Jerry Kay, all the work you saved my little hiney on the audit. I can't thank you enough for all the work that you put into the reviews. It's a lot of work to review everybody's transactions, and there's not not enough of me to go around. And so I really appreciate her detailed reviews as she goes through the files. She's going to make mistakes. I've made mistakes too. You know, if we don't know certain things or we don't have copies of everything, or maybe they just didn't get attached to the file. We have, you know, seen that happen. Just be nice and email us back and say, Rochelle, hey, you missed the Form 17 or you missed my Earnest My receipt. We have been known to make mistakes. We're human, just like you are. But the more help we get on this, the more eyeballs, the less, you know, risk we're going to have and the less challenges we're going to have with DOL and MLS audits as they come down the pipe. So have a great week, you guys. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll talk to you next week. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Have fun in Vegas. Go win big.
Right on.